Hello everyone, I am Arturo. It is a beautiful Saturday out. I'm not a news reporter, we're going to stop that. I have a simple question for everyone in the audience. Are you devil worshippers? Ooh, alright. Well, I hate to say it to you all, but I believe you're all lying. You with your passing ideas along about how the world works. You with your questionably colored shirts and your admissions to it. You all have the ideas have been planted in your brains and you don't even know it yet. You have to turn back to the Bible. Okay, everyone level with me real fast. Do I sound like a crazy person right now? If I sound crazy, congratulations. You're all normal. What am I on about? Well, I'm on about a topic which is very close to me because it has impacted me, all of you, and the rest of not even just the United States, Europe, and I'm sure it's going on for a lot of other places too. What I'm talking about is a period in history called the Satanic Panic. So, according to my survey results, let me start there. 0% of the participants of the survey had any idea what the Satanic Panic is. So I had to adjust my speech for that. I have a lot of background knowledge from this because of hobbies I am very close to, but I've also done 2 weeks of research in preparation for this. Let's get a brief understanding of what this is first, shall we? The Satanic Panic is a series of events that sprung from religious people's fears, had a considerable impact since its beginning, and leaves a lingering effect on us all today. Let's start by getting a brief view and getting that survey out of the way. Let's understand what the Satanic Panic is. One could compare the Satanic Panic to a modernized witch hunt. For those who are more familiar with American history, there have been many times in American history and European history long before of people being convicted of being witches for simple things and on very, very odd instances. You could be convicted of a witch if you weighed as much as a duck. That's ridiculous. Nowadays, you would think that in this modern day and age, we'd be a little bit smarter about how we handle this. But apparently not. I'm sorry, I'm blanking. The Satanic Panic was a mass fear of an insidious occult threat. If that sounds confusing to you, basically what that means is that everyone believed that there were hidden cults everywhere. That's not a pleasant thought to have around you constantly, but it was what many people went through. This predominantly took place in the 80s, but we're going to get more on the timing later. As explained in the Satanic Panic in the Missouri General Assembly published by the Missouri Legislative Library in October of 2020, this moral panic saw large swaths of the country swept up in the belief that hostile outside agents sought to steal children en masse in order to sexually assault and or kill them as part of the practice of devil worship. That should hit you very heavily. Imagine the fear of having your children taken away by a cult to, the most respectful way I can put it, violate them. It's not a good thought. And it's unfortunately something that many, many people went through. This fear was common among Christians and other religious groups. According to the Satanic Panic, published by Skeptic in January of 2019, fear of satanic cults trickled first through certain types of Christian churches, and once people had the idea of hidden satanic cults, they began to see signs of Satanism everywhere they looked. That was why I was doing that thing in the beginning, to kind of accentuate what that would have looked like. So to recap everything, in case that was confusing. The Satanic Panic was a mass panic, predominantly among religious peoples, that malicious forces intended to subject people to the horrors of devil worship. Although it persists today, nothing can compare to the influence of its heyday. Satanic Panic, as I previously stated, took place in the 1980s. Some would consider the witch hunts and the Salem witch trials that I briefly aforementioned before as satanic panics as well. But when people say the satanic panic, they're usually thinking about this period in history. That is what we will be discussing in this speech. Many, many things fell victim to the overall panic. This can be both in the forms of people and it can be in the forms of objects and modern things of the day. What does that entail? I should note that I'm going to be using a particular favorite hobby of mine, Dungeons and Dragons, to explain it. Bless you. Dungeons and Dragons, to briefly recap for those who don't recall my last speech or have never heard of it, is a fantasy role-playing game in which many people get together to envision an imaginary scenario in a fantasy world. To briefly recap everything there, that made it a very big target. Although I'm not going to be going over everything that was mentioned in this massive panic, I will list off a few of the smaller results. Pokemon, a very common game played by children and adults nowadays. Heavy metal music. For those of you who like your head-banging music where you're swinging your heads around, yeah, that was seen as devil worship back in the day. Electronics. That was seen as a form of devil worship. Computers, TV. Even shows like Bewitched could be seen as devil worship. According to, I'm sorry, I forgot to write something down. The Satanic Panic began in the 80s, to recap that one more time, and it targeted what was new and hard to understand. According to A Darker Maze, published by Skeptic in January of 2019, Dungeons and Dragons cults may have led to Missing Boy, one headline announced. Newspapers speculated that Egbert, a boy who was explained to have gone missing, may be dead. The victim of an elaborate intellectual fantasy game may have become all too real. It later turned out that these stories were wrong, but by then the damage was done. So you might be wondering, if we are not burning people at the stakes nowadays, what did we do to them? Very good question. 12,000 trials for something that was not ever a real threat. Does that sound ridiculous to you all? It should. The court system's already backed up enough nowadays. We don't need them filled up with things that don't matter. People who were involved in the occult were brought to actual trials over a non-existent threat. Let that sink in. Travis Brooks, writer of The Devil's in the Details, an analysis of the Satanic Panic, written on April 8th of this year, tells readers that allegations were further inflamed by the Satan hunters, who latched onto the McMartin trial, a trial in which a boy was believed to have been sexually assaulted in a child daycare center. They alleged that the Satan abuses had occurred or speculated about satanic cult involvement to the media. In 1984, Lawrence Padzer went to speak personally with the parents of the children involved in the McMartin trial and advised them that anyone could be a satanic cultist. All across the country, a mounting pile of similar trials began. Many of these would go on to have heinous results. Now, you may be asking, whatever happened to it? Good question. Many people will tell you that it died down in the 90s. They're partially right. It began to dwindle, but it still existed. It still exists even today, and we just don't know about it. Why? That's a good question. Simply put, all fads like this tend to die down eventually. But also eventually people started to gain something we like to call common sense. It's amazing, isn't it? The Satanic Panic began to settle in the 90s, but it never truly ended. Dungeons and Dragons has survived the Satanic Panic and it thrives, but it isn't out of hot water yet. Catholics and Capitalists, published by Dissent in spring of 2022, claims D&D hasn't quite lost its countercultural reputation yet, in large part because of how Christian rights weigh on deviltry shape the game's image. But with D&D poised for superstardom, there may once again exist a temptation to bestow the game with powers it doesn't really possess. And would you look at that, people? We just made the same mistake again in modern day that we made back then. Today, the false stories of devil worship became a form of entertainment for us now. According to the Houses of the Unholy, a product review by Publishers Weekly on August 8th of this year, Houses of the Unholy is a haunting noir graphic novel by I cannot pronounce this name, I'm sorry, Brubaker and Sean Phillips. The story follows Natalie Burns, a woman who works to rescue indoctrinated children from cults. Natalie, who was once caught up in a satanic panic of the 1980s, is approached by an FBI agent to investigate a series of murders involving her fellow accusers. Now, while this sounds like a good novel, keep in mind, people thought this was real. If you showed this to people back in the day, they'd be screaming their heads off. Nowadays, we laugh at it. It's a story. It's something we go to in the movie theaters or something we pick up off the bookshelves like it's nothing. We've made novelty out of hysteria. Pretty common theme if you look back at history. So, to summarize everything one more time. Wrong speech. The Satanic Panic was a period of mass hysteria caused by religious peoples getting the wrong idea about modern day things. It led to many trials, and it led to many instances being blown way out of proportion or completely misled. Many modern day things, such as Dungeons and Dragons, TVs, certain books, and so on and so forth, all became victims of this mass hysteria, to put it nicely. But in modern times, it has begun to dwindle down, and it has become a joke to an extent, something to laugh about and play with and frolic with. I could never, no matter how hard I try, explain everything or go over every trial or every victim in the form of businesses and games and such that have been subjected to the problems that this has created. So I highly advise everyone to do your own research on this topic. Why? Because things like this happen all the time, and we just don't know it. We get swept up into things that we don't understand, things that we don't know, and just get whipped into a frenzy just from what other people say. So it's very important that we all understand when things like this are happening so we don't end up getting swept up into it ourselves. So now we all know, none of you in here worship the devil. But are you safe from the devil and those who worship it? No. Are you safe from the devil in those who think you do? Thank you for coming tonight.